Welcome everyone. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so welcome, and today's SVT Dharma talk is all about what it is to understand our practice rather than simply be, if you like, stuck in the theory around our practice. It's a short sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya. It comes from the book of Nidana, that's chapter 12, and it's sutta 12 within that chapter. At Savatthi, bhikkhus, there are these 4 kinds of nutriment for the maintenance of beings that have already come to be, and for the assistance of those about to come to be. What for? The nutriment of edible food, gross or subtle. Second, contact. Third, mental volition. And fourth, consciousness. A mental volition there is the sankharas, and these are the 4 kinds of nutriment for the maintenance of beings that have already come to be, and for the assistance of those about to come to be. When this was said, the Venerable Moliyaphagguna said to the Blessed One, "Venerable Sir, who consumes the nutriment consciousness?" So it's interesting to have a little bit of background about this particular monk. And the commentary and the comments on the sutta suggest that he was what we might call a theorist, someone who understood the theory and wanted to understand more about the theory, but whose practice hadn't extended, if you like, into giving some of the information that he needed to understand the theory. So here's someone who, if you like, has a lot of book knowledge and has perhaps listened to a lot of suttas, but has not actually been practicing. So he wants to know who consumes the nutriment consciousness. And the Buddha replies, not a valid question. I do not say one consumes. If I should say one consumes, in that case, this would be a valid question. Venerable Sir, who consumes? But I do not speak thus. Since I do not speak thus, if one should ask me, Venerable Sir, for what is the nutriment consciousness a condition? This would be a valid question. So here we're changing the nature of the question. And the Pali here is very interesting, because in the first question, who consumes, or who consumes the nutriment, the first person, the grammar of the first person is present. But in the reformulating of this question, the grammar changes completely to be completely impersonal. So there's a very distinct change in the Pali here. It's taking the identity out completely and substituting in, through having the absence of the first person, an implication that a process is happening rather than someone doing it. So, Venerable Sir, for what For what is the nutriment consciousness a condition? This would be a valid question. To this, the valid answer is the nutriment consciousness is a condition for the production of future renewed existence. When that which has come into being exists, the 6 sense bases come to be, and with the 6 sense bases as condition, contact. So the Buddha has now turned this round completely, and he's gone from the agency of the individual to explaining a process. And I think we can all recognize that there's times in our practice where we identify completely with what's going on. And this identity happens in a number of different ways. So one of the ways it happens is that we want to possess the experience. So there's something happened in our practice, and we take ownership of it. So we make it mine. And this is quite simply an expression of craving, tanha, wanting this experience, liking the experience, wanting it to be ours. Or we have a more subtle expression where we take this experience as an expression of, or as perhaps an expression is the best way to say this, an expression that I exist. Because I experience this, I am. So this is the more subtle conceit that I exist. Or thirdly, we can simply take the experience as an aspect of myself. Because I have this experience, it is a part of me. So it's not wanting to possess it, but the very fact that I experience it means that I am, it is a part of me itself. So when we have those types of reactions, then we take, it's what Bhante Vimramsi would describe as taking the experience personally. And as soon as we do that, as soon as this first person pronoun comes in, then we've set ourselves up for the chain of dependent origination. Because we've taken the experience, whatever it is, out from the 6 senses, and because consciousness has arisen and the 6 sense bases are there and contact has arisen, we get feeling. And the sutta comes on to this feeling, this process of moving into feeling. And then dependent origination comes in and we get craving, which is when the first person pronoun starts coming in. So this craving, this identity with experience, is when we fail to see the process that's happening. If we see the process happening, we can't have the identity. So it's a little bit like in science, there's this famous theorem, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And it simply says you cannot know, for instance, the speed of something and its position with equal accuracy. So you either measure the speed of a moving car accurately, in which case you have to measure it over quite a long distance with the time. But because you've measured it over a long distance, you can't say where in that distance it actually had that speed because it's an average. Or if you want to know where the location of the car is, you don't have enough time to measure its speed. So this is the uncertainty principle, and the same uncertainty principle, if you like, happens in our experience. We either identify with our experience, in which case we don't see the process, or we see the process and then we don't see the identity. And what we've got here with this particular monk is he's so caught up in the theory the rational reasoning, if you like, says, well, something must be experiencing the experience. And yet the Buddha is saying, well, if you want to think of it in those terms, then there's no valid answer I can give you, because the supposition you start with is incorrect. But if you start thinking about it in terms of conditionality, what does consciousness condition? Then you begin to see the process that's underlying it. So here's a very good example of our starting point dictating our experience. And so I'm reminded of another scientific theory, which is the waves and particles of light, for instance. And depending on how you set up your experiment, you can either measure light as particles, or you can measure light as waves. And so the Buddha is saying, well, what is the perspective you want to start with? If you start off with the perspective that one experiences, then you can't see what the Buddha's describing. But if you then set up with your expectation to understand the process behind the experience, then you do. So, having been told this about consciousness, the Venerable Moliyaphagguna then went on, well, Venerable Sir, who makes contact? Not a valid question, the Blessed One replied. I do not say one makes contact. If I should say one makes contact, in that case, this would be a valid question. Venerable Sir, who makes contact? But I do not speak thus. Since I do not speak thus, if one should ask me, Venerable Sir, with what as condition does contact come to be? This would be a valid question. To this, the valid answer is, with the 6 sense bases as condition, contact comes to be. With contact as condition, feeling. So in the Buddha's explanation here, he's not simply saying that it's important to understand the conditioning that created contact, but it's also important to see what contact then conditions. So we're having to see, rather than focus on the present moment, and Venerable Sister Kema was very keen on this, of getting away from the idea of a present moment and substituting that with a present time, because with the present time, rather than an individual moment, we see what comes before and what comes after. And this is essential in order to see a process, because we have to see the originating cause and what that then conditions into the future. So this is where I think Bhante Virahamsa's description of concentration being collectedness rather than one-pointedness is very helpful, because it encourages the mind to have this broader perspective, to be wider, to see processes happening rather than individual moments. And so it enables us to see more clearly, particularly in the meditation, but especially in daily life, the context around our experience. And it's the context which brings the understanding. Because when we focus on the moment, yes, we can see impermanence. And with impermanence, we can see dukkha, and to a certain degree, we can see anatta. But there's this passage that Bhante Ramsay used to refer to, which said that someone or a practitioner who sees the three marks, impermanence, dukkha, anatta, does not necessarily understand dependent origination. But those who see dependent origination will always understand the three marks. And so this context of bringing the mind into a wider frame of reference is very important. And this sutta, I think, is beginning to describe why. Because we need to see the context in which these things arise. So the Venerable Moliyaphagguna was not satisfied with this. So he said, Venerable Sir, who feels? Not a valid question, the Blessed One replied. I do not say one feels. If I should say one feels, in that case, this would be a valid question. Venerable Sir, who feels? But I do not speak thus. Since I do not speak thus, if one should ask me, Venerable Sir, with what as condition does feeling come to be? This would be a valid question. To this, the valid answer is, with contact as condition, feeling comes to be. With feeling as condition, craving. So again, the Buddha's highlighting here, the really important part of seeing how consciousness gives rise to the six sense bases, which gives rise to contact, which gives rise to feeling, which in turn gives rise to craving. And it's the craving here where the first person appears. The I like it, I don't like it mind. And it's this I like it aspect which is driving the monk's questions. I want to understand. I want to see. I want to know. And we all recognize this when we get into our meditation sometimes, where Bhante Ramsay's invitation was always simply observe. And then the I gets involved. It wants to understand. It wants to experience certain things. It wants to hold on to experience. We might have had a particularly fruitful sitting. And so our next sitting, we want to repeat that. And so we're holding on to the previous experience. So whenever this first person comes up, this is the time that we need to work with right effort. Because whenever the first person comes up, we're turning the experience into something unwholesome. Not in the sense of something morally bad or reprehensible or anything like that, but the simple process of identifying with experience. Who craves? Who feels? Or in the sense of our own individual practice, I feel, I crave, my contact. As soon as we do that, we've moved away from this observing mind, which will see the process, to this individual perspective, which then sees it or manifests this sense of ownership. And as soon as we do that, we lose the capacity to see the process, because the two can't coexist at the same time. We can't own an experience and see an impersonal process. We can't personalize an experience and understand the impersonal. So these things are mutually exclusive. And in our meditation, we flip from one to the other and back again all of the time. And as we develop our practice, there'll be times when we're more in the impersonal than in the personal. And that's how the understanding develops. But even if we've done a lot of practice, we will find that there'll be sits where we're more into the personalizing it than the impersonal. Particularly if we feel that there's some new understanding has come. And the temptation there is to feel that this is my understanding. I now understand this. And so we have to be very patient with ourselves of seeing this flip from one to the other and back again. And to see that when the first person comes up, when the ego, if you like, manifests, it always creates suffering of one degree or another. And that suffering may be very subtle. Yeah? It may be the subtle wish to re-experience that experience in the meditation. But as soon as we have that wish, it just gets in the way of the practice. So this is what the Buddha's teaching is. Observe this process. See how one creates suffering and one is free of suffering. See how there's identity, which then breaks up the awareness of the process. See how we have a tendency to take things personally and observe things from an impersonal perspective. And of course, Venerable Moliyaphagguna was again not satisfied. Because as a theorist, there are always more questions, more reductionist questions. Well, if not this, then what about this? If not this, then what about this? Venerable Sir, who craves? Not a valid question, the Blessed One replied. I do not say one craves. If I should say one craves, in that case, this would be a valid question. Venerable Sir, who craves? But I do not speak thus. Since I do not speak thus, if one should ask me, Venerable Sir, with what as condition does craving come to be? This would be a valid question. To this, the valid answer is, with feeling as condition, craving comes to be. With craving as condition, clinging. So, again, the Buddha's describing the context in which to see craving. It needs to be seen in the context of feeling and clinging. It shouldn't be seen as a separate entity in itself, because it can't exist as a separate entity in itself. It's a conditioned state. So, if it's a conditioned state, something must have conditioned it to start with, and because it's part of a conditioned process, it itself must condition something else. And if we see that occurring, then we're observing dependent origination. So the Buddha in this instance goes on to say, let me just get to the start of the chapter here. So he says, with craving as condition, clinging, with clinging as condition, existence or habitual tendencies. Yeah. With habitual tendencies as condition, birth, or the birth of experience, respective and relative the same. With birth of experience as condition, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair come to be. So here's the expression of dukkha. Okay, and that might simply be the death of experience, for instance. So in our meditation practice, as soon as we take ownership of what's happening, whatever it is that we observed from a impersonal perspective then disappears. It gets crystallized in our mind. We hold on to it as an experience, but we're no longer seeing it as a process, which is what originally revealed it. So although this could be described in terms of birth and rebirth, we can think of this as birth and rebirth of experience in the present as well. But Phagguna, with the remainderless fading away and cessation of the six sense bases for contact, comes the cessation of contact. With the cessation of contact, the cessation of feeling. With the cessation of feeling, the cessation of craving. With the cessation of craving, the cessation of clinging. With the cessation of clinging, the cessation of existence. With the cessation of existence, the cessation of birth. Or with the cessation of the habitual tendencies, the cessation of the birth of experience. With the cessation of the birth of experience, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair cease. Such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. So what here the Buddha's describing to Phagguna is that not only do you see what conditions the arising of these things, but also when you see the condition ceasing, what has arisen ceases itself. And so this is the classic description of dependent origination. When this arises, that comes to be. When this ceases, that ceases. So this whole sutta, this short sutta, is a very human sutta, I think, because even though Moliyaphagguna is sticking to his guns, if you like, around the identity around experience, we recognize this in our own practice. And the Buddha is just saying, no, you need to change your perspective. If you take the view that it's in this way, then you won't understand the teaching. But if you take your view in this way, in other words, ask a different question, allow yourself to observe in a different way, then you'll see a completely different perspective. So what I like about this particular sutta is its humanness. It's like you can kind of imagine just being in this group of monks, and Moliyaphagguna is simply asking a question that must have been present in many of the monks' minds as they began or expanded their practice. It's so easy to take identity with the experience and to own the practice and to get caught up in what's going on, rather than stepping back and simply observing and letting it play out. And of course, that's very challenging to the ego, because the ego, believes it's the agency. And so every time we do step back, we're beginning to weaken that first person identity. And it is the weakening of the identity which gives us the route to the cessation of dukkha. And if we like, so here we also have a description of the Four Noble Truths. That if we ask the question in the wrong way, we create suffering. But if we ask the question in the right way, we see the path to the cessation of suffering. And so here we have, the second and third Noble Truths being explained in the context of meditation experience. Okay, so let's just let that settle in, and perhaps just take a few moments. If you want to sit comfortably, and just allow your inner thighs to rotate towards the center line. So And that just helps release out your hips and open up your sacrum. And come into your body just below the navel, deep in the body, and just bring your awareness there. And this is an energetic center which allows us to be energetically supported and relax the physical body, which is so useful in meditation. And then drop the inner edge of your shoulder blades, parts of your shoulder blades right beside the spine. Just let them drop a little and you'll feel the shoulder blades rotate and the space around your heart open out. So now you begin to feel there's a little bit more freedom in your spine. So if you come into this energetic center and allow it to just move in a small circle, you'll feel a lot of your spine is free to move. Now if you smile, you'll notice that will extend up into your neck. And if you relax the crown of your head, you'll notice that your head is just softly free to move. Now relax any tension and bracing around your brain and softly smile. And allow your sense of loving kindness to come up, and wherever you are and whatever stage of the practice you're doing, let's continue. Attention to the sense of contact with the ground or the seat of your chair or whatever you're sitting on. Connect to your breath and softly and gently take a deliberate breath in and out, and slowly open your eyes. Okay, any questions or reflections on the sutta today?
I don't really have a question, more of a reflection. So I always find these kind of reflections useful whenever someone gets angry at me for whatever reason. It's always helpful for me. I mean, the reflection doesn't always come immediately. So obviously my first reaction will be, oh, what have I done wrong to, get such a reaction from so and so? And usually there's a bit of anxiety or stress or tension or whatever. And then once that settles down a little bit, and this kind of reflection is like, okay, it could have been anything. It could have been just a simple gesture or word or whatever form of contact, and it probably has nothing to do with me as well. And it's all based on when the other party heard or saw something, whatever that may be, that triggered a reaction, and the whole dependent origination process in that person's mind occurred, which I obviously have no control over. So it's a very useful technique, I find, to kind of console myself, in the sense, but it doesn't come up automatically. Obviously, the first part of it is like a lot of reflection, anxiety, and what did I do wrong? What could I have done better, and etc. etc. So yeah.
Well, I think it sometimes will come up automatically, and when it does, those are the times when the remarks don't make any impression on you. It's when the remarks make an impression on you, that's when if someone's remarks make an impression on me, that's when I've taken it initially personally. But then I can reflect, and then it doesn't. And then there are times when the remarks just pass me by completely, and that's when I haven't taken it personally. And there may be times when I get completely hijacked, where I've taken it personally and stuck with that option. Yeah. And that's an important, it's important to recognize that. It's important to recognize when the remarks don't make an impact, because that's when your understanding is operating. Yeah. And what's really interesting here is that this idea of who craves, this is the way that we sort of use normal speak in daily life. For some reason or other, scientific analogies are predominant today. So this is like Newtonian mechanics. It's good enough to get someone onto the moon. But if you want to understand the fundamentals of reality, you've got to go down into quantum mechanics. And if you like, the Buddha is about, quantum mechanics. It's about seeing the underlying nature of things, really. But for the vast majority of people, they're in Newtonian mechanics because it works and it's something they understand, and it's kind of tactile and feels real, and no one's actually perhaps given them the opportunity to see that there may be something different, and so that's where without hopefully without a sense of arrogance or hubris, that's where compassion comes in. That if we're stuck with that perspective, there doesn't seem to be much that can be done. We're just driven by our actions and reactions all of the time. And so this is why I rather like a perspective around the Buddha's teaching as being a scientific approach, because it is a process of observing what's actually occurring. But we have to develop the tools in order to see that. And that's the process of cultivating meditation, to see this more clearly. And as the scientists saw things more clearly, they realized that the Newtonian description of things, although adequate for almost everything, weren't the ultimate explanation of what was going on. And that's what meditation does. It develops the tools to see that what we would normally have assumed was the process of action and reaction isn't actually what's going on, and there are other things it can do. And so I'm just fascinated by that process.
Another thing which I thought to I occasionally reflect on is the brilliance of the Buddha's wisdom, because he gave us a tool where if we practice more and more taking things impersonally, we are kind of releasing our mind, or releasing the tension around constantly, being in that state of suffering. And when we do that, by releasing that energy, that negative energy, we actually allow more room for us to how should I say, enhance our brain's potential in the positive sense. So in the sense that because we are reducing that anxiety, worry, tension, stress, we have room, in a sense, we have more room to be more efficient in whatever we want to do. So of course he emphasized a lot about the 4 Brahma Viharas, which is, starting from loving kindness and all that. And if we realize our full potential of practicing that, obviously that's beneficial for us and the people around us. But I tend to also think that his wisdom somehow also enabled us to free up space for us to be more efficient in everything that we do, because we have taken away that tension.
If we make this connection between tension and the first person pronoun, the sense of I, it takes up so much energy when it's present. It takes up so much of our resources. But when that drops away, those resources become available for something else. And I think that's what you're describing very, very clearly there. And so, what the Buddha's describing in this sutta is that we can incline our mind in one perspective, and all of the time we're asking, who's experiencing this? This identity all the time. Or we can take another perspective and see it as a process. And when we're part of a process, then the process simply plays out. But because we're not identifying with it, we don't get the whole chain of dependent origination, because it's the craving onwards that is so consuming of time and energy and effort in our lives. And we know that when we get caught up. When we get caught up, it just takes over our lives. And the colors and influences everything that's happening. And then when we finally let it go, it just feels like we've set down a burden, and the whole experience feels very different. So thank you for that. Anyone else like to add something in around what we've been discussing here?
Yeah, Hugh.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's just that the last things you saw, it was kind of what I was thinking about this week. And even just in meditation before your talk here. So for example, I sat down. I probably had too much coffee, and it's it's just an aversion. It's very uncomfortable. And I apply the process 6R, and you're sort of in one territory in one moment, and then I don't exactly know what, but at a certain moment it takes, and you're in a different mindset altogether,
Mm-hmm.
which is surprising. Yeah, so this is where I am with figuring out and relating really to hindrances and seeing how that works out.
Yeah, well, the hindrances are different expressions of taking something personally. They're different ways that we can take something personally. Yeah. So we can have doubt arise, we can have anger arise, we can have restlessness arise. These are expressions that only crystallize or condense onto the sense of I. And so when our perspective takes that perspective, that becomes available. And there are other contexts which describe that when we have that sense of I, we become accessible to Mara. But when we don't have that sense of I, we're inaccessible to Mara. And to see the way that our meditation just flips. Like this, so when we're into the process, then we're in jhana, for instance. But as soon as we identify with perhaps a jhana factor, perhaps the joy that arises, then we've then observed that and made the factor of the jhana our object of attention, which is one of the distractions of working through the jhanas. We need to come back and stay with the Brahma Viharas. But then as soon as we make it my joy, we come out of the jhana altogether. And so we can see this process of identifying with jhana factors and then redirecting our attention onto jhana factors and then making them personal. Brings us out, or we can see we begin to own something in the practice in another way, and that again gives us the opportunity for the hindrances to then condense onto that sense of I. So this whole little sutta is describing, for me, the whole process of the meditation from this perspective, and I think that's very, very helpful, and we see it in the jhanas so clearly. So yeah, thank you for that observation. Would anyone else like to ask a question around the sutta, or around general practice, or any other aspect of things going on in TWIM?
Hugh, I
Yeah,
actually have one more question.
please go ahead.
Please. I wonder if you can maybe help me with this. There's often in any sort of like, let's say, I don't think, sort of a classroom setting, for example, my question will be like, how do I ask, how do I get to the best possible question? Like, how is there maybe like a process of already asking questions that is helpful to get there, for example? Is this sort of clear?
I'm a little unclear about whether you're asking how do I formulate a question, or what questions are valid.
Oh, it's more directed to how do I let's say I would like to, let's say, in any given time I give my attention, get sort of the best possible understanding, and very often it happens like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 7 days afterwards, a question pops up, for example. This is fairly common. Is there perhaps a way of reflecting during a talk or reading or etc. that might help that process?
Oh, okay. Well, one of the things I find helpful for myself is being sensitive to the feeling of resistance. So in a talk, Bhante Ramsey would always encourage people not to take notes, but just to listen, and on the occasions that I did that, and it was always a great temptation to take notes because his talks were always very informative. When I did that, what I would notice is times when my mind might wander, times when I might feel a sense of resistance in my mind, and times when my mind felt like it was just going wide. And the times when they were going wide were usually times where something was being said which I found unblocked something for me. And the times when there was a sense of resistance, I felt that was something I didn't understand, because my mind hadn't gone like that. It had done something different. And so maybe being sensitive to that might be helpful to you. And you might not understand what it was you felt a resistance about, but you could write a quick note going, it's that part of the sutta, and then just simply say, can you say a little bit more about that? That might be your only question. Sometimes we feel we need an incisive question that then has a direct answer, but it might be just it might be something much more oblique than that. And certainly for this side of the process, people's questions bring out things that you wouldn't otherwise expect to say, and it's an unblocking of a process again, rather than I've got a sort of catalogue of things in my brain, which, if you ask me a question about that, I'm going to pull this one out. It's not like that. A question comes and I'm just as interested to hear the answer, and I'm waiting for it to come through. And sometimes something coherent comes out, and sometimes if nothing does, I'll simply say, I don't know. I'll have to have a think about that. Yeah.
Right, thanks. That's actually very helpful. Thanks.
Anything else anyone would like to add? No? Okay, well, just to say thank you for coming, and Maeve, might I ask you just to share the closing prayer?
Just a minute. Let me see if I can share my screen. Will you lead the recitation?
I can, yes, I just don't have it up on my screen at the moment. Yeah.
Can you see it?
Okay. So thank you, everyone, and may suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much indeed for joining today, and I hope you enjoy your day and your practice and the coming week.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, everyone.
Bye for now.
Bye.